Hello everyone, and welcome to our video on converting the maximize problems into a simplex tableau. So in the previous video, if you watched that, if you hanged in there the whole time, I hope you did, we showed the whole process to maximize a problem, which was these 8 steps. Okay, so it was all maybe deer in headlights moment, but it was this whole giant thing. Okay, so and it got messy, but what we're doing here is just going to pick apart those few steps and make sure that we can do those little tiny things before this giant big thing. All right, so in these problems, we're just going to, so it says, convert the maximize problem into a simplex tableau, and then find the pivot row and pivot column. Okay, so we'll find those two as well. All right, well, those are our first couple steps in this scenario. So step 1 is looking at this and moving all of the variables to the left. So I usually don't even show like the minusing. I know I have to minus these all over to the left side, which just kind of puts them negative, and then negative 2x1 minus 6x2 minus 9x3, and then the z is usually the last variable written, so plus z equals 0. So that's how we can convert that information, and let me just kind of cloud that up. And then looking at these, all right, so we have 3 lines. Now, in the previous video, I said this bottom one is assumed, so I usually just kind of cancel it out. So it's just saying your answers should be positive. Okay, so I usually just scribble that out because it's well known that they should be. And then at this point, they might ask something like this. They might say, hey, how many slack variables do you need? Well, I have 2 important inequalities left over, so we will need 2 slack variables. So based on these 2, so again, that bottom one doesn't matter. We need 2 slack variables. So sometimes I'll ask that first. All right, and to make that happen, well, and I'm going to convert these. Let's just put it right here. Let's put them right next to each other so I don't have to rewrite it. So this guy, I'm just going to write. Okay, so all we think is just start to write whatever you have. So 8x1 plus 12x2 plus 5x3. And this is where we say, okay, so we plus something would make it so it's no longer less than. It would make it equal. So plus something, so that's our slack variable, which we use S1. And then now we can change the inequality into equals 112. So this less than is saying, okay, so these 3 don't exactly add up to 112. But if we put in something, we don't know what it is, but if we put in something, then it should equal 112. And then we'll do it with this one as well. They're usually nice enough to show the gap if there's a missing variable. If they don't, just be careful. Okay, so I do want to kind of make sure my organization is good still. So 3x1, there is no x2, so I'm just going to skip it and just do exactly kind of what they did, plus 9x3. Here's where we just want to say, hey, it would be a different slack variable. So chances are these 2 slack variables would not be equal. So I also like to make sure, hey, so it's kind of off center of the S1 to, again, make sure that I know they are different variables. And then now I can change the inequality, less than or equal to, into just equals. Okay, so these are our main 2 equations now. And then now we can convert it into a simplex tableau. So this was our step 2. Our step 3 is to convert it. The step 3 is writing, so this is always the last row. Let's make that note again in the tableau. And what I like to do is give ourselves plenty of room. We want to list our variables up top first. So it starts with the x's. So x1, x2, there's a 3, there's an x3. And then it goes to the slack variables. So s1, s2. And then it goes to the z, or the objective variable. And then we do a vertical line. And then at this point, let's go ahead and put this line right here. I think there's enough room for our 2. So these 2 are first in this setup. And then this last one will be the bottom. I think that's enough room for it all. Okay, and all I'm going to do is just write their coefficients. So for this first one, let me even use, well, I'm just going to, let's do the star. So that is going here. So 8, then 12, then 5, then 1, then 0, then 0, and then 112. And I didn't label it. That's our constant column. Okay, so there was no S2. There was no Z in this first equation here. That was important to me. So those get zeros. And then now let's fill in these other, the second row. Okay, so double star, that's going right here. So we've got 3x1, so 3. There is no x2, so 0 goes there. There's a 9 on the coefficient for x3. There is no s1, but there's one s2. There is no z, and then our constant over there is 64. So we've got our setup there for that. And then now we do our last row. -2, -6, -9. There is no s1. There is no s2. And there's one z equal to the 0 constant. And there we are. Okay. And then so this is converting it. Okay, so we can box it. That is that answer. So there it is. All of it's done. Remember, or in the previous video I mentioned that you usually get these diagonal ones over to the right. So that's looking good. So in case it doesn't, if it looks funky, something's up. All right. It did also ask to find the pivot row and pivot column. Well, that's a little misleading. Well, not misleading, but usually we will find the pivot column first. So we want to find the pivot column. The pivot column is found by looking at your bottom row and finding the most negative value, which is right here, -9. And so we can see this is column 1, 2, 3. So our pivot column is 3. Okay, so it's the most negative in this bottom row. And even here, so you could do this. Let me just go ahead and show. There is our whole pivot column. Okay, so now I'm making it a little messy with the colors, but it might be helpful to see it. Okay, so I've got my pivot column. And then to find the pivot row is to take your constant value and divide it by the entries in these pivot column. So you've got 112. So I've got 112 divided by 5, and then that one is equal to 2. So 5 goes into 11 twice, and then another 2, and then 4. Okay, so it's 22.4, and here you could use a calculator as well. I think I'm right. Okay, so that's that first division, and then 64 divided by 9. Okay, so 64, so it's about 7 point something. Okay, so again, you could use a calculator. I don't need the whole thing anyway, though, so I'm just kind of estimating, because all I care about is whichever one is smaller. So that's this one, 64 divided by 9, and that came from the second row. Okay, so these ones divided to give us a smaller quotient. Let me go ahead and show that whole thing. So that is our pivot row. So the pivot row is row 2. But, so be careful of their answer, like when entering it. So matrices usually go row and then column for information. So we would say pivot. So they might say, just be careful, make sure you're answering it the right way. So pivot row 2 and column 3. Okay, so they usually put row information first, even though it's not the first thing that we find in these problems. Okay, so that's that. They also might say what was the element that was pivoted. You can say pivot element. And it works on this problem because this is the only positive 9. So the pivot element is 9. And they might like highlight it or do something like that. Okay, so that is finding the pivot, all of the important pivot information. And then from here is this nightmare. Okay, so doing all of the operations. Okay, so these right here is just setting up our, like, the first half of the problem, but then from there you got your row operations. Okay, so let's look at one other here. Okay, so it says maximize this. So it gives us that same deal. And then subject to all these. All right, well, again, I'm going to just scribble that out and say that's fine. If it says right away, what's the number of slack variables? You could say, well, I have 3 important inequalities, so there will be 3 slack variables. Okay, so if it asks that, we got it. But usually my first step is to just go ahead and convert this. So I'm just moving the x's over to the other side, which is negative 8.2x1 minus 8.5x2, then the plus the z equals 0. So there's that first one. And then now let's do it to these three inequalities. So we'll do our slack variable. So we've got 6.5 x1 plus 8 x2, and we're saying plus something. That's our slack variable, should equal the 45. And here I'm giving myself a little space, too, for organization. And then we'll do it to the other two. So this other one is 3x1 plus 9.5 x2 plus something, so plus s2, equals that 57. And then this last one, 2x1 minus x2, and plus something, plus s3, should equal that positive 4. Okay, so these are our main first couple rows here. Let's give ourselves a big one. So we've got x1, x2, then we have three slack variables, s1, s2, s3, and then the z variable, z, and then from there we can do our vertical line and the constant. Here we've got that first one's going to go there, that second one's going to go there, and then our third one here is going there. And then so my bracket might be a little too small. Let me go ahead and put my line like that. Remember, the objective function is always last. So this is the last row. Okay, and then now I'm just putting in the coefficients. So I've got 6.5, 8, 1, 0, 0, 0, 45. And then our second row, we've got 3, 9.5, 0, 1, 0, 0, 57. Our third starred one is 2. Then it's negative 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 4. And then now our last row is the objective function, the negative 8.2, the negative 8.5. Then there's a 0, 0, 0, is 1z, and then 0. And then notice here we got the diagonal ones going on. So that's looking good. And then still make sure all the coefficients are in the right spot. I believe they are. And so there is the main simplex tableau that they wanted there. But then they also wanted the pivot row and pivot column. Okay, so our pivot column, so that's what we have to do first. So our pivot column is the most negative one in our bottom row, which we can see is this one, the negative 8.5. So that means we're looking at column 2. And then with this, let's not use all the colors. Let me see if we could just eyeball it. So I'm in this column, and I want to do a division. Well, this has one little side note to it that we need to add. So when we do our pivot row, I'm going to just put some space, pivot row equals. Okay, so we still are doing the division. So 45 divided by 8. And if you give yourself enough room, you could put it right next to it, actually. So the 45 divided by 8, and then from there, get your number. This is where, again, it might be useful to use a calculator in case. So I didn't on the first one because it was close enough. Let me just go ahead and show 45 divided by 8. 5 point something, right? 5.625. Okay, so we've got our decimal. 57 divided by 9.5. So that's why I wanted my calculator, because I don't know what this is very quickly. My pivot column information is kind of in the way. Let me put it 57 over 9.5. Okay, so 57 divided by 9.5 gives us 6. Okay, so that's equal to 6. This last one is a negative number. 4 divided by negative 1 is negative 4. Well, we have another rule for when this happens. When we do this quotient, when we're finding the pivot row, the value has to be positive. Okay, so this negative is instantly out of the running. Okay, so our quotient, so when we do the pivot row quotient, the quotient must be positive. Must be positive. Okay, and so we have that. I think that I wrote that rule on here. Okay, so we have these other little rules that are there. So if there's no non-negative, so it says it here, the smallest non-negative ratio. So there's all these rules to it, but I'm pointing them out as we go. Okay, so anyway, so that means I'm now comparing these two numbers, whichever one is the smallest. Well, 45 divided by 8 is the winner. This one's smaller. So that means we're looking at row 1. Okay, so the 45 divided by 8, and then just kind of, instead of using my colors, I'm just going to highlight it and say, okay, so that is the pivot element. Okay, so if they did say, what is the row and column? We pivot row 1, because again, they usually want the row first, but be careful. Pivot row 1 and column 2. Or since this is the only positive 8 in all these numbers, they might say, hey, tell me the pivot element. Pivot element is 8. Okay, so, but I think the row and column's a little better, especially because sometimes you can have the same elements in here, so that could be misleading. All right, anyway, so that's it. That's taken apart a little bit of the scenarios here. Okay, so if you have questions on it, please let me know. We're just going to keep adding to our steps in these problems. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.